So, onto an actual practical example of texture density. Let's say, for example, you're making a game and your studio's art lead has said, okay, we want to optimize this game for lower end devices. So, we're going to use a 10.24 texture density. What this means is that the texture sizes for most things are going to be 1024 by 1024 texture. So, we have this texture here, which is purely just a 1024 by 1024 texture, and what that associates the number of 10.24 with that texture. So the texture density numerical value here is purely just this texture size number with a dot in the middle. So if I just set that to that, nothing changed because this is already proper texture density, because this is a 1 by 1 meter plane. Where it gets an issue is where you have higher things at a texture density. So for tiling materials, how I would do it is not everything is going to be perfectly 2 by 2 meters, but just for the example, I'm just going to make it that. All we do is we literally just set this button to 10.24 and it's going to scale it up. And then it's also going to make the texel density consistent and the size of the tiles consistent with the one over here. And then if I just select this and then snap it to here and then turn off world view, you're going to see that there's absolutely no tiling whatsoever, no obvious seam at all throughout here. So for tiling materials, generally speaking, your texture density will want to be consistent with a 1 by 1 meter plane or cube or whatever. And then you just set the rest of your objects to that scale. So purely, texture density is purely just a numerical value. It changes depending on your texture size. So let's say your art leads, okay, we've got extra budget in the game. We can make every single texture 2048, 2048 by 2048 pixels. This effectively doubles the texture resolution of each texture, of each tiling texture, and doubles the texture density. So what this means in practice is, let's say you have this and you're like, okay, 2048, we've got a high resolution image. Pretend this is a 1024 image. Pretend it's a 2048 one. If I now set this to 10.24, it goes to half. That's because we're using the incorrect scaling now. We'll want to use 20.48 using a 2048 texture size. And you see nothing changes. If I set this back to 1024 and set 10.24, nothing changes. The scale doesn't change. So realistically, you can just set everything to 10.24 and then change the texture resolution for, at least for tiling material specifically, on a whim, and you'll be fine as long as you're updating every single tiling material and every single thing is consistent with the 10.24 texture density. So yeah, you'll notice that change. Even if I change it to 4096, and I can't actually do that, but what we can do is we can go 2048 and then just press double TD, and now that's a 4096, a 4.96 texture density with a 4096 map. And then obviously if I go back here and change it to 20.48, nothing changes. Here with 10.24, here with 5.12. So yeah, this is purely just a numerical value, and I usually just work off of this value here of 10.24 with 1024, because even if you upscale the text, even if you have a high resolution texture, it doesn't actually matter. Where this does get tricky is with props. So I'm just going to duplicate this a bunch and pretend we have a bunch of props. With a normal prop, because it's not going to be tiling, it's going to be a unique UV thing that you can texture in Substance Painter. I'm just going to scale this down a bit and make it like 4. What you have to do is double the actual texture resolution, but keep the same 10.24 texture density. So what that looks like in practice is, if I just remove this, let's pretend these aren't tiling materials and that they're like proper props. If I unwrap these, if I scale them down a bit more, so it's an actual example. There we go. And then let's say we have our texture resolution for a tiling materials is 1024 by 1024 with 10.24 texture density. You realize we can't actually fit these into a single UV map like we would want for props. So what we can do instead is double the texture resolution, but then set the same texture density, and now we can fit them in. And we can actually fit a lot more in because we've effectively doubled the texture resolution but kept the same texture density. This is the same if we go to 4096. If we do this now with 10.24, we just double the actual resolution, but then keep the same texture density. This is why in games, if you've ever done like, if you ever looked at a game's 3D model outside of like characters and you looked at an environment, normally you'll notice that like they have really small squares or like really small UV islands, but then a really like big texture map like this. That's because the texture density here is still 10.24, but we're just changing the actual size of the UV of the um image texture here. So and then if we want this to be 20.48, we can't tile again. So then if we want these four to fit in one map, we'd have to set the 4096 and then set the texture density at 20.48, and now we can do it. I wouldn't go above 4096 for a single texture. Like you can go to 8K. I can do custom using 8,000, but if you have a lot of objects and let's say you have a 20.40 texture density and using a 4K map, I would just separate them into a different texture set. So like let's say we have 8 textures here. We set this to 20.48. We could probably fit more in, but let's just assume we can't. If I just space these out, like this. So I mean, we can actually probably just fit one more in. I will do that, to be honest. And then I'm just gonna, yeah, fuck it, just squeeze it in, and hope and pray that we can. Maybe I'll just move this one up and this one down, and then maybe we can't. Who knows? It doesn't matter. Like the examples here. So let's say we have these objects, and then we have well, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 objects here. Let's say we have another 8. We have 8 more of similar sizing. Well, we obviously can't fit this into the 4096. We've just duplicated it. So I would just separate this and make it like a new material. It's called like props underscore O2. Obviously, this is not proper naming convention or whatever, but I would then just separate that into another 4096 texture resolution. So like, it's all about maximizing the space on your UVs while keeping this number consistent. It doesn't have to be exactly 20.48. Like let's say that example before where we couldn't quite fit that. We couldn't quite fit this in. So what we can do is we can scale these down. Like if I set this to individual origins here, we can scale these down slightly, and now we can fit everything in seamlessly. And then we can calculate it. And it's 19.23. It's not great. We can scale them up a bit to maybe like, just like scale them up a bit, space them out a bit, and now it's like 19.9. And realistically, all we're missing here is that 0.48. Like you can do mixed scales and stuff like that, and it'll keep the same texture density, like a similar texture density. But generally speaking, you want to keep as close to that base number that you set as possible. Hopefully that made sense.